On June 29, Doug Ford was officially sworn in as Premier of Ontario after the Progressive Conservatives, riding a wave of populist anger at Kathleen Wynne's government, wiped out the Liberals in the provincial election. He has promised radical changes to government spending, climate change policy, hydro rates, education and more, but it's still unclear how he will pay for it all. Check back here over the coming months for an up-to-date primer on the transformation in Ontario and what it means for you. Table of contents: Doug Ford has had a few incarnations before becoming Premier, son of a Tory MPP, brother and right-hand man to controversial Mayor Rob Ford, then a party leadership contender to replace Patrick Brown after he was ousted over sexual assault allegations. Ontarians will see a lot of new faces with Mr. Ford at the legislature, both on the PC bench and among his transition team staff. But they'll also see Tory veterans in cabinet who ran against Mr. Ford for the party leadership, such as Christine Elliott, Caroline Mulroney and former interim leader Vic Fedeli. Here are some of the names to know. Cabinet. Notable members of the 21-person cabinet include Vic Fedeli, Finance, Peter Bethlen-Falvey, Treasury Board, Christine Elliott, Health, Caroline Mulroney, Attorney General, Rod Phillips, Environment, Transition Team, Chris Froggatt, Chairman, John Baird, former Conservative provincial and federal cabinet minister, Simone Daniels, Deco Labels and Tags Executive, Ruben Devlin, former CEO of Humber River Hospital, Mike Coates, Public Relations Executive. More reading: Doug Ford and his people just months before the municipal election. Mr. Ford has announced plans to cut the number of Toronto City Council positions from 47 to 25, ward races that candidates have already spent months fundraising and door-knocking for. He also announced the cancellation of 4 other municipal campaigns already underway, the elections of regional board chairs in Peel, York, Niagara, and Muskoka. Mr. Ford, who served as a city councillor from 2010 until 2014, said the proposed changes are meant to dramatically improve the decision-making process for local governments. Mayor John Tory is calling on the provincial government to hold off on downsizing council and let the public decide through a referendum. And while a number of suburban councillors, many of them former allies of Mr. Ford's, lined up to show support for the Premier's plan, many others accused him of using his new role to settle old grudges. Councillor Kristen Wong-Tam called the proposal extremely anti-democratic, and an affront to our democracy. More reading: Municipal Politics. Ontario's high electricity rates were a divisive issue in the 2018 election, with the PCs and NDP promising big changes at Hydro One, which the Wynne Liberals partly privatized. During the campaign, Mr. Ford threatened to fire Hydro One CEO, Mayo Schmidt, and the whole board, and once in office, he threatened to tear up employment contracts at the utility. Mr. Schmidt announced his immediate retirement on July 11, and the entire board resigned. By the Globe and Mail's estimates, Mr. Schmidt's exit could give him about $8 million in compensation for stock awards, plus $1 million in bonuses and pension payments and a $400,000 payment announced by Hydro One. The utility also has to pay the 14 previous board members $4.9 million for their stock holdings. The PC government plans to introduce legislation to increase transparency and accountability at Hydro One, which announced a new board on August 14. Mr. Ford also says he will bring hydro rates down with accounting changes and the return of Hydro One dividends to taxpayers, each of which would cost about $400 million. Ministers to watch: Greg Rickford, Energy, Northern Development and Mines. More reading: The Politics of Your Hydro Bill. Under the Wynne government, Ontario, Canada's second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, after Alberta, joined with Quebec and California in a cap-and-trade market to bring emissions down. Mr. Ford is scrapping cap-and-trade, and Quebec and California have closed their market to Ontario to prevent last-minute dumping of emissions allowances. That has left billions of dollars worth of carbon credits in limbo. Cap-and-trade's demise also put Mr. Ford on a collision course with the federal government, whose carbon framework requires each province to have either a tax or a cap-and-trade system that meets national standards, or else Ottawa will impose its own carbon price. Ottawa announced late July they are drastically reducing the scope of its planned carbon tax to address competitiveness concerns as it prepares to replace Ontario's cap-and-trade system with its own levy. Mr. Ford is challenging Ottawa's right to do that, backing a legal challenge by the Saskatchewan government of Premier Scott Moe, but the two have little support from their counterparts in other provinces. In addition to the legal battle, Mr. Ford's government said it will move forward with a constitutional challenge to the federal government's plan to improve the carbon tax. Mr. Ford is also scrapping several incentive programs that were designed to help Ontarians reduce their carbon footprints. Here are some of the changes that could affect you. Canceling 758 renewable energy projects, complicating plans by municipalities, farmers and First Nations to develop small-scale electricity generation. Taxpayers could be on the hook for millions of dollars as owners invoke compensation clauses to recover money they've already spent. Canceling the Green on Rebate program, which helped homeowners install energy-efficient heat pumps, insulation or other features. Existing rebates will be honored until the end of October. Canceling rebates for buyers of electric cars and charging stations. Vehicles sold and registered as of July 11 will still be eligible for the rebates, as will vehicles now on dealers' lots that are sold and registered before September 10. Ministers to watch: Rod Phillips, Environment; Jeff Urek, Natural Resources and Forestry. More reading: Emissions and Environment. Mr. Ford ran for office promising to roll back two Wynne-era overhauls of Ontario's school curriculum. One was sex education. The 2015 curriculum, which addresses topics like consent, digital safety and same-sex relationships, has divided educators who say it's a necessary modernization and social conservatives who say it's age-inappropriate. Ontario's education minister said in mid-July that the old sex curriculum would come back into effect this fall, but later she appeared to backtrack, saying consent, cyber safety and gender identity would still be taught. The other school subjects Mr. Ford promised to change is math. Wynne-era guidelines emphasized discovery methods of creative problem-solving, but Mr. Ford wants more basic methods to be taught. Ministers to watch: Lisa Thompson, Education; Marilee Fullerton, Training, Colleges and Universities. More reading: Education. In an effort to remake Ontario's social assistance system, the Progressive Conservative government announced reductions to planned increases in rates for two of the largest programs in Ontario's social safety net, Ontario Works and the Ontario Disability Support Program, which have a combined budget of $8.7 billion. Former Premier Kathleen Wynne's Liberals approved annual increases of 3% over the next 3 years. Nearly 1 million people use the two systems. The government also announced it would cancel Ontario's Basic Income Pilot Project, which was meant to provide money to 4,000 low-income people in Hamilton, Thunder Bay and Lindsay for 3 years. Ontario Social Services Minister Lisa MacLeod said the current system is too disjointed and expensive, and blamed the Liberal government for creating a system that spends money on handouts that actually do little if anything to break the cycle of poverty. It is not clear how or when the project would wind down. Ms. MacLeod continued to say Mr. Ford's government's new assistance program would be focused on jobs. The current Basic Income Project, which cost $50 million annually, provided people with the means to test whether extra money improves their job prospects and quality of life. Ministers to watch: Lisa MacLeod, Minister of Children, Community and Social Services. More reading: Social Services. For many asylum seekers crossing the U.S. border into Quebec and Manitoba, Toronto, which last year affirmed its status as a sanctuary city, has become a crowded refuge. The rising number of mostly Nigerian asylum seekers has strained the resources of the city shelters, and Toronto's Mayor John Tory asked for more funding from Ottawa and Queen's Park. Instead, in July, Mr. Ford withdrew provincial support for asylum seeker resettlement, saying the federal government had created a problem they must fix themselves. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau questioned whether Mr. Ford was well informed about Canada's refugee situation and its obligations to asylum seekers under international law, and later told Mr. Tory that the federal government will support Toronto's efforts to provide for refugees. "Canadians, we are there for each other," Mr. Trudeau said. 2 weeks later, Mr. Trudeau created a new cabinet post to address migrant and asylum seeker crossings, and chose Bill Blair, a former Toronto police chief, as Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. Ministers to watch: Lisa MacLeod, Minister of Children, Community and Social Services. More reading: Asylum in Canada. Toronto is among the safest large cities in North America, though a rising number of deadly shootings this summer have shaken public confidence in that. Toronto's mayor and police chief blame gang activity for the rise in violence, and the city is pressing the province to tighten bail conditions for people convicted of previous gun crimes. During the campaign, Mr. Ford also suggested bringing back the controversial Toronto Anti-Violence Intervention Strategy, TAVIS, a now disbanded police task force that deployed rapid response teams to neighborhoods that had seen violent crimes, but also disproportionately targeted Black and Indigenous men for street checks, better known as carding, and was accused of racial profiling. After a deadly mass shooting on the Danforth Strip, Toronto City Council pressed Ottawa to ban the sale of handguns in the city, and asked Ontario to ban the sale of ammunition. But Mr. Ford opposes a handgun ban. Instead, he pledged $25 million in funding over 4 years for police and the court system, and ruled out new funding for community programs aimed at reducing violence. More reading on guns and crime. Mr. Ford ran for office vowing $6 billion in spending efficiencies, but without cutting public service jobs. He never explained in detail how he would pay for that, and it's unclear what effect his promised cost-cutting measures so far, a freeze on most government hiring except police and correctional workers, a halt to discretionary spending on everything from travel to newspaper subscriptions, would have on the province's bottom line. In the meantime, former BC Premier Gordon Campbell has been tapped to lead an independent inquiry of the Liberals' spending, with a public report due by August 30. Ministers to watch: Vic Fedeli, Finance; Peter Bethlen-Falvey, Treasury Board. More reading: Ontario's economy. Mr. Ford took office amid a bitter trade war between the United States, its NAFTA partners, Europe and China. In June, the Trump administration slapped tariffs of 25% on Canadian steel and 10% on aluminum, and is also weighing heavy tariffs on auto manufacturing that could seriously hurt Ontario's manufacturing heartland. Mr. Ford, who, like his predecessor, holds his cabinet's intergovernmental affairs portfolio, has said he'll present a united front with the Trudeau government during the complex negotiations for a new North American free trade agreement. But at the same time, Mr. Ford dismissed the province's trade representative in Washington, Monique Smith, as part of a purge of Wynne-era appointees to key posts. Mr. Trudeau is also changing his lineup to deal with Mr. Ford's government and the trade file. In July, the Prime Minister chose one of his most trusted confidants, Dominic LeBlanc, as Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, and appointed Jim Carr to a newly created International Trade Diversification job. Ministers to watch: Jim Wilson, Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. More reading: Trade and Tariffs. Mr. Ford, whose years in municipal government were spent extolling the virtues of subways, wants Queen's Park to take a more active role in how public transit is run in Toronto. During the campaign, he said a PC government would take over Toronto's subway network and give it billions in new funding. He's also mused about an expensive plan to bring subways to Pickering, a community far to the east of the city that is already serviced by GO Transit. Ministers to watch: John Yakubuski, Transportation; Monty McNaughton, Infrastructure. More reading: Ontario on the move. Mr. Ford's rise to power coincided with Canada's historic legalization of recreational cannabis, but while other provinces will have bricks-and-mortar weed stores operational by October, Mr. Ford's change of tack on cannabis policy is delayed in Ontario until 2019. Soon after taking office, the PC government turned to private retailers to sell marijuana, an abrupt shift from the Wynne government's plan for LCBO-run stores. Under the new regime, the province will be in charge of wholesaling cannabis to retailers, and will be the only legal online store starting October 17. But private businesses won't be able to open outlets until the new retail framework is set up by April 1. The Ford government is also giving municipalities a one-time window to opt out of allowing local cannabis stores, raising questions about uneven access across the province. As for more traditional intoxicants, Mr. Ford announced he will lower the minimum price that people are allowed to sell beer to $1 plus deposit. Though it's unlikely that retailers would regularly sell it that cheap, prices at the beer store are set by the breweries who own it, not the province, and the brewers most likely to afford the low price would be multinational corporations. Many Ontario craft brewers have refused Mr. Ford's Buck a Beer challenge, saying they will not sacrifice quality just to reach the lower price point. Mr. Ford also said he'd allow beer and wine sales in any grocery or convenience store, not just the handful of grocery stores now authorized to sell alcohol. Ministers to watch: Christine Elliott, Health; Vic Fedeli, Finance, which oversees the LCBO; more reading: Drugs and Drinking. The main voice of opposition against Mr. Ford's government will be Andrea Horwath's New Democrats, whose surge in the June 7 election brought them to official opposition status. The Liberals, meanwhile, will have to get used to a greatly diminished role at Queen's Park. With too few MPs for official party status, they'll have fewer privileges and opportunities to speak in the legislature. With Ms. Wynne resigning her leadership of the party, Liberals will also choose a new leader at a to-be-determined date. More reading: The NDP and Liberals compiled by Globe Staff Photos, Associated Press, The Canadian Press, iStock Photo, Fred Lum, Melissa Tate and Kevin Van Possen / The Globe and Mail, Tim Fraser for The Globe and Mail,